Hey everyone, it's Charlie from Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. I am super psyched to have Brittany Davis from Narrator here to talk about data and to talk about data-driven cultures. How we can get away from being hooked on the dashboard all the time, and how we can sort of think about things a little differently, but still drive a data-driven culture. Just as a heads up, we will try and do some more of these virtual stack-up series. We might start doing a little bit in person, as we sort of transition back into in-person mode. What we realize, though, is that making these recorded and streamed gives us a lot more people access to what we're doing, and to be able to jump in even if you are in the office and out of your house. So Brittany, you can queue up your presentation. There's a share button down at the bottom, and I will get out of your way when that's up. Cool.
And you
Yes, we can. Awesome.
great. All right. Thanks, Charlie, and thanks everyone for joining. Today, I'm going to be talking about building a data-driven culture without using dashboards or without heavily relying on dashboards. Before I jump in, I can give a little bit of background on myself. My name is Brittany Davis. I lead the data team at Narrator. If you haven't heard of Narrator, it's a platform that's designed to let anyone ask and answer questions using their data in minutes. So you'll see over the course of the presentation, Narrator is a platform meant to address some of the things that I'll be talking about today. But a lot of the challenges that I bring up actually stem from my experience as a data scientist. So before joining Narrator, I had worked as a data scientist alongside product teams and marketing teams at both like a large enterprise company as well as a fast growing startup. And now fast forward today, I'm at Narrator, and we work closely with companies that have existing data infrastructure that are trying to improve upon that, as well as companies that are setting up their data system from scratch. And time again, we've seen a lot of the same things play out when trying to build a data-driven team. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And so, wherever you are in your journey of building a data-driven team, regardless of whether or not you're a data scientist, bringing in awareness about some of the common things that can hinder a company on that path, and what we can do about it. So I'll talk a little bit about how dashboards have evolved to kind of become the center of what we think about when we think about being data-driven. I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that come up by relying so heavily on dashboards to help us do things like democratize data. And I'll talk about that specifically from the technical and organizational sides, because I think both are very important in understanding kind of where things break down. Because a lot of times people only have kind of visibility into one side or the other. And then finally, I'll talk about an alternative approach that we're using instead of relying so heavily on dashboards at Narrator that helps address some of these problems. So to get started, I first want to talk about, when we say data-driven team, what do we actually mean? You've probably heard a lot of these buzzwords before, like democratized analytics, visibility to performance, quality and accuracy, self-serve data, and probably some version of this data maturity pyramid. So in order to understand, what will happen, or more of the predictive aspect, we first need to understand what happened, was it good or bad, and work our way up from there. So you've probably seen some flavor of this. One definition of a data-driven team that I actually really like comes from the Mode Analytics team. And this is how they describe kind of their highest level of data maturity. And they describe it as, time to insights and time to decisions can happen quickly and simultaneously across teams. And data tooling becomes more customized to the business as it scales. So I just want to break this down because I think there's a lot in here that can help tell us like what actually needs to happen in order for us to be data driven. The first is time to insights and time to decisions can happen quickly. So this automatically right off the bat tells us that we can't just staff up a data team so that we can answer questions quickly. That's just not scalable, and we can't do that simultaneously across teams unless you have unlimited resources. So right away that tells us that we need tooling. We need that to actually start to put these resources into the hands of people who are making those decisions. And when we talk about the how with the tooling, we need the tooling to become more customized as the business scales. So what this means to me as a data person is, as the business gets bigger, we might have different teams. It's no longer just the marketing team. It's like the paid marketing team, the paid social team, the organic team. And the questions become more and more specific and more nuanced. And so the analyses need to be customized and the insights need to be to address those nuances. And that is a really, really challenging thing to do as we scale, especially for a tool. I mean, I have a hard time even thinking about any tools that get more custom as a company grows. So this is a really hard thing to do. And today, the main tool that we're using to do this is dashboards. Whenever we think about a data-driven team, we think about dashboards. And this makes sense, right? Because if we think about, how teams usually get started using data, typically they'll start with the what happened, right? The bottom of that pyramid, Dashboards are really, really good at telling you what happened. Total sales over time, great. Total customers over time, revenue. Dashboards are really, really great at that. But then when we get a handle on the what happened and it's time to start moving into the was that good or bad? Why did it happen? What will happen? It only makes sense, right, to layer on those analysis pieces onto the dashboards that we're already using to understand what happened. So what we end up doing is we end up gravitating towards dashboards to do things that they weren't built to do. So when we talk about, was that good or bad? A dashboard, depending on the metric, is not really that great of a tool for that. Yes, if your total sales goes down, we know that's bad. But as soon as you start to get more customized, get more nuanced, we start tracking more specific metrics. And the question of was that good or bad requires context. And dashboards oftentimes don't have the context needed to actually assess, okay, this number is moving in that direction. What should I do about it? Or I need to understand that number in context of this other number that's maybe a balancing metric. And so if one goes up and the other goes down, it's okay. So there's a lot of context that's missing when we go to dashboards to understand what's good or bad. And then the second piece is when we start to kind of test our hypotheses and what I call insight discovery, the why did it happen and what will happen. When we have more in-depth questions, we often will go to dashboards to understand, okay, well, I need to explore a new question. I need to explore why something happened. And this can be pretty dangerous when we start pushing dashboards beyond their initial kind of intended use, which is just kind of understanding what happened. I think the best way to describe this is with an example of when we start using dashboards for insight discovery, how that gets out of hand, because I think this is a very common path that a lot of teams that are starting to use data will embark on, and it only gets worse as time goes on. And I think in order to understand this properly, we need to understand both what is the output, what is the report, but then also what is going on under the hood, because that's really where things start to break down. So we might start with a simple report, right? We want to know total sales over time. Easy, right? Well, in order to create that dashboard, we need a SQL query under the hood. So this little scribble here is my depiction of the complexity of that SQL query. If you are used to working with SQL, I think you can resonate with the fact that this is a 15-line SQL query using one data source, pretty simple. But if you aren't working in SQL, I think this scribble does a pretty good job of characterizing, okay, like we understand it's a little complicated, but at the end of the day, if we needed to detangle this, we easily could. If someone asked a question about like, oh, how are sales calculated? We could easily go to this query and kind of like unfurl it to understand, okay, I know what's happening. It's relatively transparent. That is the code that is powering our simple sales dashboard. But then a few months go down the line, our company starts to grow, and now the sales teams have become regionalized, which means that we need regionalized reporting. You know, a specific sales team in a region needs to know how they're doing instead of sales overall. So now we need to add a filter to our dashboard so that we can break it down by region. Now, when we do that, we just need to add a simple column. Our query gets like a little bit more complicated. Now, instead of a 15-line query, it's an 18-line query, but it's still from one data source. And if we needed to detangle it, we still probably could. Pretty simple. But now, say sales starts to drop in one particular region. Well, we might have a hypothesis about what's driving that change that we want to explore, this like insight discovery. Maybe we want to understand specifically the breakdown by sales channel, right? So maybe a certain channel isn't performing as well as it was in the past. Maybe based on our like marketing channels, for example. Well, in order to test that hypothesis, in order to answer that brand new question, we need to bring in another data source into our report, add in another filter. But now this time under the hood, not only does it take a lot longer to actually get to this view, it takes longer to build, but you can see here it's a lot more complicated. And that's because now we're not using data from just one source, we're using data from multiple sources. And that's very common in the business world, right? If you think about the types of business questions that we want to ask questions that relate to how our customer is behaving. And because the customer interacts with many systems, when we ask questions, we don't care that like our marketing channel information came from our marketing ad platform and our sales data came from our CRM system. At the end of the day, we just have a simple question. But what we don't realize, or a lot of times there's not visibility into, is how complicated SQL gets when we start to layer on more information. And again, like this is just a test, a hypothesis we have. It's just a new question that we need to answer. We don't even know if it's going to be informative. We just need to have the tools available at our fingertips to explore it. So now we have this like pretty messy SQL query under the hood that's powering our reports. So the report still looks pretty simple, but we have this like complexity. So now a few months down the road, when the support team starts to say, okay, well, we think that like, certain sales channels are, giving us more like billing issues. We want to understand the breakdown of like what billing issues people are having and what sales channel they came from. So now the support team has a specific request that uses the same data, but in order to layer that onto this report is really complicated. Maybe the data person or engineer who goes to look at this code says, this is a little bit like hairy. People are using this dashboard. I don't want to like change something and maybe break it or incorrectly calculate something because I don't totally understand this complex mess. I'm just going to create my own separate view. So this is really, really common in data where things get complicated and then we just kind of spin off a new version, and now we're maintaining two complicated versions. Now we have our sales dashboard and we have our sales dashboard for the support team that has another set of assumptions, another set of filters. The only issue that comes up here is now when the sales team and support team talk to each other, they're using different numbers. So they get mad at each other because they're trying to make decisions but don't have the same information. And then on top of that, they go to the data team to say, hey, like, why don't these numbers match? And the data team has to, dive into these complex queries just to answer the question of, how was this calculated? And this is so, so common in data that we've actually over the years started to build dedicated roles to manage this complexity. So now we have, specific types of roles like this analytics engineer, which has gained a lot of popularity in the past couple of years, and their goal is to build tools and infrastructure to support the efforts of the analytics team as a whole. So what they're doing is taking this complex query and making it into this less complex query. So it's a little bit easier. And we're also using tools like dbt and lookers, lookml, to make things a little bit less messy under the hood. But just because we bring in, experts and tooling to manage that mess doesn't mean that the mess isn't hard to manage. And as time goes on, it still gets much more complex. It just gets complex at a slower rate when we use these tools and have dedicated people focused on it. So this is getting us along the path of moving towards a more complex future as the company changes, and that's what slows down our time to insights and time to decisions. And so because we're so focused on managing the complexity, we can't actually take a step back and say, okay, like, what is the right way to do this? This is getting more complicated over time, and what is the solution that we should be using to actually solve these problems? I heard an interesting analogy the other day. Someone said it's like buying the fastest plane to get to the moon. No matter how much you invest in the plane, with the turbojets, advanced GPS, you're never going to get to the moon, because at the end of the day, planes weren't built for that, right? And we're doing the same thing with dashboards. We're pushing them far beyond what they're initially intended to do, and we've gotten better at making them faster and less complicated under the hood. But at the end of the day, the complexity is growing so fast that we're not able to address it well enough. So there's two core flaws I'm talking about here, and these are the two flaws that I want to address when I talk about an alternative solution. So one is going back to what I mentioned earlier, is lacking context. So in order to make a decision with the data, our dashboards need to be able to tell us things like, is this good? Is this bad? What do I do about it? And the second piece is the complexity. So with dashboards today and the way that we're modeling the data under the hood, the complexity is increasing as we ask new questions. So, and that's because dashboards were intended to answer questions that have already been asked before, right? The data set that has already been prepared, the filters that have already been added, but as soon as a new question comes along, we need to layer on the complexity, and that just gets out of hand. So I want to talk about a new approach, or a couple new tools we can use to address some of these problems. The first one is using live analyses in a story-like format. And what do I mean by that? So when I say live analyses shared in a story-like format, I really mean an analysis that is dedicated to a specific question. It still has data visualization similar to a report, but the main difference is that it has all of the context that you would need to make a decision. So now, instead of having all of these plots lying around, not knowing how they should be used or what they mean, now we have the context baked into each one and telling the reader what they should get from it. And so you'll see up here, this is how we share these live analyses at Narrator, is we have the question and the goal right up front and center. And we also have the recommendation, the so what. Okay, here's the change you should make based on the data that we're seeing. And next to every single plot, we have interpretation and why that plot is important in how we make our decision. So this is really helpful, because making this in a live format too means that as the data updates, you always have the most up-to-date information. And we can even condition these details here, this context here, that if the data changes, let's say it falls below a specific threshold, we can dynamically update the recommendation so that you're never making the wrong decision, you're never getting the wrong interpretation. And this is gaining a lot of popularity over time. So data storytelling has always been something that's been prevalent in the data world, but there hasn't been a ton of tooling to actually support it. And now you see companies coming up with ways to share analyses on top of real data in that story-like format. And so with this, just to summarize, we always have the context, the interpretations are never misread, plots always have a specific purpose, and the analyses are repeatable, right? If it's live, we can rerun it and and always have the logic that was used to create it. And then the second piece that we're recommending is using an activity schema for that insight discovery problem when the complexity gets out of hand. So what do I mean by using an activity schema for insight discovery? So traditionally, those like data models that you were seeing, those SQL queries that I was representing, are traditionally constructed with something called a star schema. And so star schemas are the traditional way that we've been doing data modeling, but as data changes and as we need to layer on more information, these things can get very complex and very out of hand. And that's because each table is designed to answer a specific set of questions. But when we move to an activity schema, as the data grows, as we have more concepts that we want to represent, the data grows, or the table grows, in a very simplistic way so that it's easy to debug, it's very transparent, and we can actually, represent our data simply without adding complexity as the company changes. And that's because we represent each concept as a building block and then use that building block to, assemble the data set that we need. So now we can ask brand new questions just by assembling building blocks to say, okay, I want to understand which tickets were submitted right before someone canceled their subscription or ended their subscription. And there's a lot more flexibility when the data is represented this way to actually ask new questions that have never been answered before. So I added a link here for more information and technical details on the activity schema. I definitely encourage you to look into that because I'm not going too far into the details here, but it is a very interesting way of thinking about how we represent data. And either way, you're using a UI to kind of get answers to your questions, but a lot of teams who are trying to democratize their data are already doing that anyway, right? They're putting data into the hands of people who might not necessarily know how to use SQL, and representing that data in this building block-like format gives them even more flexibility. So just to kind of wrap up here, the two things that we're introducing to kind of help these data-driven teams move away from dashboards and some of the challenges that they present is to share those live analyses in the story-like format instead of sharing dashboards, and then also using the activity schema for the insight discovery, because the activity schema is something that can help you answer new questions quickly, and it stays simple and manageable as the company grows. So what we see here is dashboards absolutely still have a place and a purpose, and they're very useful. But let's not push them beyond what they're intended for, and instead start thinking about what is the appropriate tool to use when we need to share context, if it's good or if it's bad, or when we need to do insight discovery. And that is what we've been using at Narrator for the past 3 years now to help companies build their data-driven teams. So thank you. That's everything I wanted to cover today. But if you have any additional questions after this or later on, I put my email here in case you want to just shoot me a note. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
That's awesome, Brittany. Thank you so much. And we even got a little bit of art there, some recursive art.
I know.
In the end, so that
haven't seen that in a while.
Question: when you're hiring for a data team, I'd actually be curious as to your background before you joined Narrator. And sometimes a lot of startups see people who have academic data backgrounds. And I would just be curious about your take on bringing the folks who can do the calculations and the math behind the data into the startup environment and the commercial environment, and ways to onboard or just vet the people who work better in those environments.
So you're asking people who work better in more of the academic environment, bringing them into the startup environment, and best way to do that.
Or whether or not you find that other places to hire good data people as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think too, especially as like talking about like from the startup perspective, the first hire a lot of times that people will bring on is the data scientist, and data scientists relative to the other data roles will skew more towards coming from like academia and like very statistics heavy. But I think a lot of the challenges that come into play is like when it comes to making that person successful in their role, there are all these other things surrounding the data scientist that need to be in place in order for them to be successful. So regardless of their background from, academia, or maybe they were doing it at another company, having like the data warehouse in place, oftentimes you have, either a data oriented engineer or a dedicated data engineer managing that, or just even having like broad strokes understanding of, what are the key areas in the business that need like focus. And a lot of the, like answering those questions is done by a skilled analyst. So I'd say like in order to be successful, in order for these roles and these hires to be successful, I think we need to think about like all of the things that need to be in place first before we bring someone on with like maybe a heavily technical skill set.
Gotcha. And one last question before we go. Are there any things that you want to be able to do easier as a person on a data team that, if startup founders are thinking about, opportunities, what's not out there that you wish was easier?
Honestly, and this is like part of the reason why I'm focused on what I'm focused on, is because I really do believe today, like the effort to answer simple questions with data is so high. And oftentimes it's so frustrating for kind of business stakeholders to understand why. And, the data people working in the warehouse trying to sift through what data is what, get really frustrated. Like, yes, the question is simple, but the data that's needed to answer the question, you need to stitch from all these different sources. So I do think like that is a huge area of opportunity, because in order to answer the complex questions, we need to answer the simple questions too, and quickly, so we can learn more. So I think that is definitely like a big area of opportunity, especially as these companies are starting to focus and invest more in like actually how do we get the most value out of our data.
Gotcha. Cool. And Peter just threw in a question late. How are the recommendations made in the story format?
Yeah, so good question. So we call them narratives. But the way that we create the recommendations is a lot of times we'll sketch out the analysis, say, hey, I want to answer this question. What are all the assumptions that I need to check? What are the different things I need to investigate in order to come to a conclusion? And a lot of times like that process is referred to as like decision science, where you think through what are the inputs or what's the information you need to gather. And then before you even look at the data, based on, yes, no for this number, up, down for that number, this is just decision I'm going to make. And so once we have that like framing, we can actually code in the recommendation to say, if this condition is met and that number is below this threshold, recommend X. Otherwise, recommend Y. And it's some flavor of that type of conditional logic, sometimes more advanced than others, that we use to actually make sure that the recommendations are dynamic, but it's built by data scientists to make sure that those assumptions are checked in the right ways.
Gotcha. Cool. Brittany Davis from Narrator, thank you so much for spending at least lunch our time with us, and we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem.